she sat alone. That is the first thing you would notice if you walked into courtroom 14 of the Harrington County Civil Court on that particular Tuesday morning in November. Not the grandeur of the carved mahogany benches, not the hushed electric anticipation of a room full of people waiting for someone's life to be decided, not the small army of attorneys gathered in expensive formation on the opposite side of the aisle. She sat alone. Vivienne Ashford-Crane, 34 years old, 7 years married, 3 months separated. She occupied her chair at the plaintiff's table the way a lighthouse occupies a cliff, perfectly still, unmoving, and utterly terrifyingly solitary against the size of everything arranged against her. Her hands rested flat on the table before her, a single legal pad, a single pen, a manila folder of documents she had organized herself. Because she had no legal team, she had chosen not to retain one. Those in the gallery who knew this murmured among themselves in a quiet, uncomfortable way. The way people murmur at the scene of an accident they did not cause, but cannot stop watching. On the opposing side of the courtroom sat Dorian Crane, surrounded by 4 attorneys, 2 paralegals, a financial consultant, and his girlfriend Margaret Cole, who had been permitted to sit directly behind him in the first row of the gallery. Close enough to pass him notes, close enough to remind everyone in the room what this marriage had actually died of. Dorian looked at Vivienne across that wide courtroom floor with an expression that was worse than anger. He looked at her with pity, the practiced, theatrical pity of a man who has already decided he has won. He leaned toward his lead attorney, Winston Falk, and said something that made Falk smile. They did not bother to lower their voices. Vivienne heard every word. She did not flinch. She picked up her pen, made a small, precise note on her legal pad, and breathed. Just breathed. And the courtroom, packed full of witnesses to her loneliness, waited for her to break. She did not break. The humiliation began at 9:14 in the morning. It began the moment Winston Falk stood from his chair, smoothed his jacket, adjusted his cufflinks, and addressed the court with the comfortable, expansive authority of a man who charges $450 an hour and has never once doubted it was worth every cent. "Your Honor," he said, gesturing with one open hand toward Vivienne as if presenting a minor curiosity, "the petitioner appears before this court unrepresented. We want to note, for the record, that Mr. Crane's legal team offered, on 3 separate occasions, to pause proceedings to allow Mrs. Crane sufficient time to secure counsel. She declined. We simply want it understood that this choice was entirely her own." The room breathed. Vivienne wrote something on her legal pad. She did not look up. "Noted," said Judge Hollis. Her eyes moved briefly to Vivienne with something that might have been concern. "Mrs. Crane, do you wish to proceed without representation?" Vivienne raised her head then. Slowly, deliberately. "I do, Your Honor," she said. Her voice was low and clear, carrying the kind of quiet precision that comes not from aggression, but from absolute certainty. Falk pressed a smile down into his jaw and returned to his seat. Dorian watched his ex-wife with something colder than contempt. He watched her the way you watch something small that has wandered too far from safety. Almost sympathetically. Almost. Then Margaret Cole, from the front row of the gallery, in a voice calibrated to carry just far enough, leaned toward the woman beside her and whispered, "She has no one, not even a friend in the gallery." "Did you notice?" The woman beside her looked, confirmed it, nodded slowly. She was right. The gallery behind Vivienne was empty of supporters, no family, no friends, no familiar faces turned toward her with encouragement. There were journalists. There were curious strangers. There were people who had read about the divorce in the financial sections of 2 newspapers and come to watch the dissolution of a marriage they found interesting. But not one single person who loved her. When the first witness was called, a former colleague of Vivienne's named Sandra Pruitt, a woman who had once called herself a friend, she took the stand and proceeded to describe Vivienne as emotionally unavailable. Cold, more interested in her family's reputation than her marriage. Vivienne sat with her pen still and listened. She did not object. She did not flinch. She wrote 2 sentences on her legal pad and underlined them. Falk cross-examined his own witness with theatrical warmth, building a portrait of Dorian Crane as a man who had loved generously and been met with the specific coldness of a woman raised to prioritize legacy over love. He used the word dynasty 4 times. Each time, he said it the way you say something that should be an insult but is dressed as an observation. "Mrs. Crane," he said at last, turning to address her directly, "is it not true that you refused on multiple occasions to allow your husband any meaningful access to your family's financial estate? That you kept him deliberately outside that world?" The room waited. Vivienne looked at him with those storm-gray eyes. "Mr. Falk," she said quietly, "you don't ask a question like that unless you already understand very little about the world you're referencing." Falk blinked. Then he smiled, the smile of a man who has mistaken composure for weakness. "No further questions," he said, and sat down. And in the gallery Margaret Cole smiled too, because it looked to everyone watching as if Vivienne Ashford-Crane had nothing. No support, no counsel, no family, no power. It looked exactly like that. But something moved, just barely, behind her storm-gray eyes. Something that looked almost like patience. There are families in this world who carry their power loudly, who wear it in their logos and their press releases, in their charitable galas and their political endorsements. Families who have learned that visibility is protection, that noise is armor, that the best way to guard what you have built is to ensure the whole world knows it exists. And then there are families like the Ashfords. The Ashford family does not operate in public. This is not modesty. It is not insecurity. It is the ancient strategic wisdom of people who understand that true power, the kind that reshapes industries, that quietly finances senators, that has held the same address for 4 generations. True power does not perform for audiences. It arrives. Edward Ashford III, Vivienne's father, had built Ashford Holdings from his mother Eleanor's original textile empire into a privately held conglomerate touching 6 industries across 4 continents. He did not appear on Forbes lists. He did not accept honorary degrees. He had declined 3 presidential appointments over the course of his career for reasons he never publicly explained, and the requests had kept coming anyway. His daughter Vivienne had grown up understanding 2 things with absolute clarity. The first, that the Ashford name, spoken in the right rooms, operated less like a name and more like a weather system. It changed the atmosphere of whatever space it entered. The second, that her grandmother Eleanor, matriarch, architect, and the family's living conscience, had spent 50 years teaching every Ashford child that strength means nothing if it cannot be exercised with restraint. Vivienne remembered sitting across from Eleanor in a sun-filled drawing room, both of them holding teacups, perhaps 14 years old, when Eleanor had looked at her and said, with the calm precision of someone placing chess pieces one by one onto a board, "The most dangerous thing a powerful person can do, Vivienne, is show their hand before the moment demands it. Let them think you are small. Let them grow comfortable in that belief. Comfort makes people careless. And careless people make mistakes that cannot be undone." Young Vivienne had asked, and then Eleanor had smiled, the smallest, most devastating smile imaginable. And then she said, "You simply arrive." Vivienne had chosen to come to this courtroom alone deliberately, not because she had no support, not because the Ashford family had abandoned her, but because Vivienne had asked them, had insisted on facing the first stages of this proceeding on her own terms. She had told her father the night before she filed for divorce, "I need to stand in that room first as myself, Papa, as Vivienne, not as an Ashford, Not yet. Edward had looked at her for a long time. And if it becomes too much, then I will call you. She had not called, because Vivienne Ashford-Crane was not in that courtroom simply to win a divorce settlement. She was there to understand, with the full documented clarity that only a legal proceeding can provide, exactly what Dorian Crane was willing to do when he believed she was completely alone. She needed to see it clearly. She needed the record to show it clearly. She needed every lie, every condescension, every theatrical piece of cruelty performed by his legal team and his witnesses and his girlfriend in the front row of the gallery. She needed all of it documented, witnessed, and entered into the permanent record of what this man was when he believed there were no consequences. Because the Ashfords do not move impulsively. They collect. And then they move with the kind of force that cannot be answered. Her grandmother had taught her that. And 3 months ago, when Vivienne had finally, quietly, precisely, made one phone call, she had not called a lawyer. She had called Eleanor. And Eleanor had said, with the calm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, "Tell me, which day?" By 11 o'clock, Winston Falk was in his element. He moved through the courtroom the way certain men move through spaces they have claimed. Loosely, expansively, with the particular ease of someone who has stopped worrying about the outcome and started enjoying the performance. The financial documents were entered into evidence. Falk's narration of them was masterful in its way. He constructed a narrative of a marriage in which one partner had contributed everything, emotionally, financially, professionally, while the other had remained behind the elegant glass of her family name, contributing presence where partnership was required. "Mr. Crane," Falk said, addressing his own client on the stand with the warmth of a practiced theater director, "would you describe, in your own words, the moment you understood that this marriage was not, and had perhaps never been, an equal partnership?" Dorian composed his face into something the gallery would read as sorrow. "I think," he said slowly, "it was the 3rd anniversary. I had planned something very personal, very us, and she canceled, for a family obligation." He paused. It was always a family obligation. The Ashford name was the 3rd person in our marriage, and it always came first. Sympathetic murmur in the gallery. Vivienne wrote on her legal pad, but here, and only the most careful observer would catch it, something changed at the edges of the room. A door at the far back of the courtroom opened briefly, just barely. A figure, tall in dark clothing, appeared in the gap for 2 seconds, surveyed the room with calm, deliberate attention, and then withdrew. The door closed without sound. Vivienne did not look up, but her pen stilled for exactly 2 seconds, then continued writing. Falk was concluding his witness examination when Vivienne raised her hand. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "I have questions for this witness." The gallery stirred. Even Falk blinked as if he had briefly forgotten she was capable of speaking. Judge Hollis nodded. "Proceed, Mrs. Crane." Vivienne rose. She took 3 steps toward the witness stand. No notes, no legal pad, just herself, standing in the space between the table and the man who had spent the last hour rewriting the history of their life together for an audience. She looked at Dorian for a moment. He looked back at her with the confident ease of a man who has no reason to be afraid. And then she said, quietly, "I have just 2 questions. Take your time with them." Something crossed Dorian's face then, something too fast to name. A flicker, the briefest disruption in the confidence, like wind moving across still water, gone as quickly as it came. But it had been there. The recess was, in its way, the cruelest part, when the room emptied and the noise retreated into corridors and coffee cups and the self-satisfied murmuring of Dorian's legal team celebrating what they clearly believed was a foregone conclusion. When all of that drained away, what remained was the silence, and Vivienne in it. She had not eaten. She had not risen to stretch or speak to anyone or find water. She sat with both hands flat on the table, her eyes focused on the middle distance, and she simply held herself together. A young court aide approached tentatively with a small paper cup of water. "Ma'am," she said softly, "can I get you anything?" "This is very kind," Vivienne said, looking up with a small, real smile. "Thank you." The aide hovered for a moment, clearly wanting to say something more. She looked around the empty gallery behind Vivienne, the utterly empty rows, with something undisguised in her young face. "Is there someone coming?" she asked quietly. "For you?" "Someone too, yes," Vivienne said simply. The aide nodded and withdrew, looking back once. Alone again. It was in this moment, this specific particular silence of the empty courtroom at noon, the water untouched on the table before her, the filtered gray light falling across her dark hair, that Vivienne Ashford-Crane allowed herself the one thing she had denied herself all morning. She closed her eyes, and for 11 seconds she counted them. She let herself feel the full weight of it. Every humiliating word from the witness stand, Margaret's voice carrying across the gallery, the pity in the murmuring crowd, the theatrical compassion of Falk's performance, Dorian's face, the face of a man who had loved her once, or said he had, arranged now into the comfortable superiority of someone who believes he has already won. She felt all of it. Her jaw tightened, her hands pressed flat on the table. One tear, a single precise tear, formed at the corner of her right eye. She did not wipe it, she let it fall. Then she opened her eyes, picked up her pen, and in the same moment, at the far end of the corridor beyond those great oak doors, the sound of measured, deliberate footsteps began, and kept coming. It began with the doors, both of them. The great paired oak doors at the rear of courtroom 14 swung open at the same moment, not loudly, not dramatically. They opened the way very large, very heavy things open when someone who knows exactly what they are doing gives them an unhurried push. And then the footsteps. Not a rush, not an entrance designed to perform itself. The footsteps that came through those doors were measured and certain, the footsteps of people who have arrived at exactly the moment they intended to arrive. Not a breath sooner, not a breath later. The gallery turned first, the way a room always turns when something enters that it did not expect. And then the turning stopped, because what came through those doors was not a legal team, or a witness, or a late-arriving journalist. What came through those doors was a family. Edward Ashford III came first. He did not rush. He did not look around the room seeking recognition or confirmation. He walked down the central aisle of courtroom 14 the way he walked into every room, as if the room had been assembled for the purpose of his arrival, and he was simply fulfilling its intent. His dark charcoal suit was of a quality that required no announcement. His silver-templed head was raised. His storm-gray eyes, his daughter's eyes, moved once with absolute calm across the entirety of the room. They found Vivienne. And something moved in his face, something that was not composure and not anger, something far older than either, something that is only possible between a parent and a child across the distance of a terrible room. He kept walking. Behind him came Eleanor Ashford. The gallery, which had been beginning to murmur, went quiet again. Because Eleanor Ashford, at 78 years old, moved through that courtroom like a force of atmosphere. She was small, she was silver-haired and pearl-throated, and she carried her cane in one hand with the casual authority of someone who has held far more dangerous things. She did not hurry. She did not acknowledge the gallery, or the legal teams, or the judge's bench. She looked at her granddaughter, and Vivienne, for the first time that day, for the first time in 3 months, felt something crack open inside her chest that she had kept sealed very carefully shut. Behind Eleanor came 3 more figures, members of the Ashford family office, 2 of the most prominent attorneys in the state, a woman who was recognizable to anyone in that courtroom who followed financial news, the general counsel of Ashford Holdings. and they arranged themselves with quiet, total precision in the gallery directly behind Vivienne's table, filling every empty row, filling every space that had been empty all morning. The camera of every eye in that courtroom moved across the faces of the gallery. The shock, the whispered questions, the leaning together, the recognitions dawning like cold water. Winston Falk had stopped mid-sentence. He had been in the process of addressing Judge Hollis about the introduction of a new document. The words had simply stopped. He stood with one hand raised and his mouth open and his eyes fixed on the back of the courtroom with an expression that was doing something very interesting and involuntary to his face. The professional certainty had vacated it entirely. Dorian Crane had turned in his seat when the gallery began to murmur. He had turned with the comfortable curiosity of a man expecting to see something manageable. He saw Edward Ashford walking down the aisle toward his daughter. Something happened to Dorian's face that required several seconds to fully complete itself. It began with confusion, an honest blankness, the brain refusing the information. Then came the recognition, slow, then fast, then absolute. Then came the calculation, rapid and visible, as Dorian's mind began running the numbers of what this meant and arriving at totals that made his jaw tighten and his hands grip the arms of his chair. And then, last and most completely, came something that lived beneath all of those things. Fear. Edward Ashford reached his daughter's table. He did not make a speech. He did not look at Dorian. He did not acknowledge Falk or the gallery or any of the machinery of the room. He placed his hand, briefly, gently, with the weight of absolute love, on Vivienne's shoulder. Vivienne's eyes closed for 1 second. When they opened, they were entirely different eyes. Still storm gray, still composed, but no longer alone. Eleanor Ashford arrived at the bar separating the gallery from the court floor and spoke, clearly, distinctly, to no one and everyone simultaneously. "Judge Hollis," she said. Her voice carried the way architecture carries, not loudly, but completely, filling every available space. "I am Eleanor Ashford. I believe you are familiar with my family's foundation." She did not phrase it as a question. "I will be sitting directly behind my granddaughter for the remainder of these proceedings. I trust there is no objection." Judge Hollis looked at Eleanor Ashford for a moment with an expression that was carefully composed. "None," said Judge Hollis. "Welcome, Mrs. Ashford." Eleanor inclined her head. "Precisely, once," and sat. The Ashford family attorney, a woman named Christine Harlow, who had argued before the state Supreme Court 6 times and won 5 of those arguments, stepped forward and addressed the bench with calm efficiency. "Your Honor, Christine Harlow of Harlow, Strand and Associates, entering appearance as co-counsel for the petitioner Vivienne Ashford-Crane, effective immediately. We have prepared a motion to introduce supplementary evidence that we believe is directly material to this proceeding. With your permission, we would like to present that motion now." She placed a document on the clerk's desk with the precise efficiency of someone who has been preparing this moment for considerably longer than this morning. The courtroom had gone very, very still. Falk found his voice. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The petitioner made no disclosure of retained counsel. There are procedural. Counsel may be retained and appear at any point prior to judgment, Mr. Falk. You know this." Judge Hollis looked up then. "Sit down." Falk sat down. In the front row of the gallery, Margaret Cole had gone very pale. Dorian was staring at the Ashford family assembled behind his ex-wife's table, staring at Edward, who had taken a seat directly behind Vivienne and was watching the proceedings with the focused stillness of a man who has already reviewed everything that is about to happen. Staring at Eleanor, tiny, magnificent Eleanor, who sat with her cane across her lap and her pearl earrings catching the light and her storm gray eyes moving once, deliberately, to Dorian's face. Eleanor looked at Dorian Crane. She did not speak. She simply looked at him, with the specific, complete, devastating look of a woman who has known exactly who he was for a very long time and has finally, at 78 years old, arrived to demonstrate that knowing. Dorian looked away first. And in that moment, in the precise moment that Dorian Crane dropped his eyes from Eleanor Ashford's gaze, the power in courtroom 14 shifted. Not gradually, not incrementally, completely. Vivienne Ashford-Crane straightened in her chair. She pressed her pen to her legal pad. And when she looked across the courtroom at her ex-husband, she was no longer the woman who had sat alone all morning. She was an Ashford. She had always been an Ashford. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to let the room know it. The reckoning, when it came, was not loud. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what happened in courtroom 14 during the afternoon session of that Tuesday in November. It was not dramatic in the way of shouting or accusation or theatrical collapse. It was worse than that. It was quiet. Christine Harlow presented evidence the way Eleanor Ashford walked into rooms, with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never doubted the destination. Financial records showing with immaculate documentation that Dorian Crane had not simply managed his marital finances carelessly, but had, over the course of 4 years, systematically redirected joint assets through 3 shell accounts, the architecture of which bore the distinct fingerprints of a plan that had not been improvised. Falk was reading a copy of the documents. The color was leaving his face in slow, steady increments. Communications, emails, text messages, and one recorded phone call obtained through entirely legal means, showing that the spontaneous romantic relationship between Dorian and Margaret Cole had begun not 3 months before the separation, as claimed in initial filings, but 22 months before. Margaret, in the front row of the gallery, had stopped looking at anyone. And finally, with the kind of quiet precision that only someone with access to very significant resources could have assembled in 3 months, a forensic accounting report prepared by a firm whose credentials the judge recognized immediately and did not question, demonstrating that Dorian Crane's claims of independent financial contribution to the marriage were not simply exaggerated. They were fabricated. Dorian's hands, on the table before him, had stopped moving. Harlow presented each document without theater. She let the evidence speak with its own voice. But it was not the evidence alone that dismantled Dorian Crane that afternoon. It was watching him understand what he was facing. Because as each document was entered, as each layer of the carefully constructed narrative Falk had built through the morning was quietly peeled back and replaced with something more accurate and far more damaging, Dorian's face underwent a transformation that the gallery, despite themselves, could not stop watching. The theatrical sorrow disappeared first. Then the comfortable confidence. Then the practiced ease. What remained, stripped of all of those performances, was something very simple and very honest. A man who had been completely catastrophically wrong about who his ex-wife was. At one point, when Harlow was presenting the 3rd financial document, Dorian turned his head and looked at Vivienne directly. She met his eyes without flinching. He leaned toward Falk and said something in a tight, rapid undertone. Falk responded with something that made Dorian press both hands flat on the table and look at the ceiling for a moment. In the row behind Vivienne, Edward Ashford watched this exchange with the focused quiet of a man who has run negotiations for 4 decades and understands exactly what each micro-expression signifies. He said nothing. He simply watched. Eleanor beside him had not moved in an hour. She sat with her cane and her pearls and her ancient, devastating composure, and she watched Dorian Crane's performance dissolve. And what crossed her face was not triumph. It was something older than triumph. It was confirmation. She had known this man would show himself given the opportunity. She had known that the most efficient way to reveal someone's true character is to allow them to believe there are no consequences. She had simply needed to wait. And in Vivienne's storm-gray eyes, for the first time today, something was present that had not been there until this moment. It was not relief. It was not joy. It was not vindication. Not yet. It was the deep, quiet recognition of a woman who was taught by the most formidable woman she had ever known that strength means nothing if it cannot be exercised with restraint, and who had, today, exercised it perfectly. She stood in the gold light of that November afternoon, and she breathed. For the first time in a very long time, for the first time in perhaps years, she breathed without holding anything back. The proceedings had been adjourned pending review of the new evidence. Falk had requested a continuance. Judge Hollis had granted it with the particular brevity she reserved for requests she found predictable. The financial settlement would be revisited. The fabricated narrative had been entered into the permanent record as exactly what it was. And Dorian Crane had walked out of courtroom 14 with the stunned, rigid posture of a man who has just discovered that the floor beneath everything he built was never as solid as he believed. On the courthouse steps, Edward Ashford put his arm around his daughter's shoulders. She leaned into him. Just slightly. Just briefly. And he held that weight with the steady certainty of a man who has been waiting 3 months to carry it. Eleanor stood before her granddaughter and took Vivienne's face in both hands, those small, extraordinary hands that had built an empire from linen and will. And she looked at her with those storm-gray eyes that were Vivienne's eyes, that had always been Vivienne's eyes. "You stood beautifully, my love," Eleanor said quietly. "All morning. You stood beautifully." Vivienne's breath caught. "You were always coming, weren't you?" she whispered. Eleanor smiled. The smallest, most complete smile. "We were always coming," she said. "Remember this. Remember the woman who sat alone all morning while the world arranged itself against her. Remember the empty gallery rows. Remember the pity in the murmuring crowd. Remember the theatrical confidence of a man who believed he had already won. And remember this. She was never as alone as they believed. She was simply patient enough to wait until the moment was right." Power does not always announce itself immediately. Sometimes the most extraordinary power in the world waits, watches, allows itself to be underestimated, and then arrives, quietly, completely, and permanently, exactly when it is needed most. Never mistake someone's silence for surrender. Never mistake someone's patience for powerlessness. And never assume that because someone stands alone, they have no one standing just beyond the door. Because sometimes the people who love you most are not behind you in the room. They are simply waiting for you to say the word. And when you do, they come. They always come. Before we go, we have 3 questions for you, and we genuinely want your answers in the comments below. First question. When Eleanor looked at Dorian and he looked away first, what was the exact moment you felt the power completely shift in that courtroom? Tell us in the comments, because that specific scene means something different to everyone who watches it. Second question. If you were sitting in that gallery and you watched Vivienne alone all morning, and then those doors opened and the Ashford family walked in, what would your honest reaction have been in that moment? Third question. Eleanor's lesson, let them grow comfortable, let them be careless, and then arrive. Is that the most powerful form of quiet strength? Or is waiting that long too great a cost? We want to hear your thoughts. Drop them below and let us have this conversation together. If this story moved you, if Eleanor's entrance gave you chills, if you believe that quiet strength is the most powerful kind, subscribe to Karma's Heiress right now and ring that notification bell. Every single week we bring you the stories of women who were underestimated by exactly the wrong people. Share this with someone who needs to remember today that you should never mistake someone's patience for powerlessness. This has been Karma's Heiress. Until next time, stand quietly, arrive powerfully, and never forget who your family is.